cognitive labor, as I define it, is really about figuring out what your family needs, what it owes to others, and then ensuring that those needs and obligations get met. We have anticipating needs, identifying options for meeting them, deciding, and monitoring or following up. Those are sort of the big picture.
Welcome to Startup Dad, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of dads who are also leaders in the world of startups and business. I'm your host, Adam Fishman. If you've ever had a partner say, "Just tell me what to do," or felt like you're the one who has to keep track of everything, the appointments, the meals, the forms, the emotional tone of the house, that's what sociologist Allison Daminger calls cognitive labor. Today, we're unpacking what that is, why even the most egalitarian couples fall into imbalance, and how we can start to share the invisible work that keeps our homes running. My guest is the aforementioned Allison Daminger, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She specializes in gender, family dynamics, and social inequality. In her new book, What's on Her Mind? The Mental Workload of Family Life, she unpacks the largely invisible mental work required to manage household life through an extensive and in-depth series of interviews with a wide variety of couples. These interviews shape the research behind What's on Her Mind and are the foundation of our conversation today. Allison is the mother of one young child in a largely balanced household. You'll know more about what that means after this episode. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Startup Dad on YouTube or Spotify so you never miss an episode. You'll find it everywhere you get your podcasts. Welcome, Allison Daminger, to the Startup Dad podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining me.
I'm so excited to be here today, Adam. Thanks so much for the invitation.
All right. So many will recognize that you are not, in fact, a startup dad.
I am married to a startup dad, though. So, that's maybe grandfathered me in a little bit.
Excellent. Love that. Well, I'm excited to have the other perspective on this show. And of course, our goal today is to help parents recognize and name this unseen mental load that drives a lot of imbalance at home, and then do some exploration around how to rebalance it, which is a big thing that you explore in some of the topics you cover in your book. And the big focus of your book is obviously cognitive labor. That book is called What's on Her Mind, and I am excited to dive in. So let's do it. I kind of want to go back to the beginning of the book. You have shown that so much of what keeps a household running isn't the physical work. That's the stuff that we can track, but it's the often invisible cognitive labor. So let's just start for folks who may not have heard of this term. And can you help me define cognitive labor?
It's tricky because there are a lot of related terms floating around on social media: mental load, emotional labor. I won't go into all of the parsing out those differences, but cognitive labor, as I define it, is really about figuring out what your family needs, what it owes to others, and then ensuring that those needs and obligations get met, right? And I further break it down into 4 pieces. So we have anticipating needs, identifying options for meeting them, deciding, and monitoring or following up. And I can break those down, but those are sort of the big picture. I often define it for people who are coming from more of a sort of professional context as project management, but for the household, right? Somebody has to make sure that things get done in addition to the actual doing. And that's really what the cognitive labor is all about.
Yeah. And we hear a lot of dads and founders on this show talk about that, mostly in reference to their partners, their wives or significant others. And so, I'm excited to explore that a little bit more and get into it. But before we do, can we talk a little bit about some examples that maybe some of my listeners might encounter of cognitive labor in their households?
The holidays are coming up, right? And for many people, that brings on a whole mountain of cognitive tasks. If your family does any sort of gift exchange, right? Step 1 is saying, okay, Christmas is coming or Hanukkah is coming or whatever you celebrate. We need to provide some sorts of gift for these 10 people. right? Then step two is identifying your options. Maybe if you're like me, you go on Wirecutter and type in something like best gift for a 5-year-old and scroll through the options. Maybe you text the parent of your niece or nephew and say, what are they into these days? Right. So that identification step can take a lot of different forms, whether it's what we typically think of as research or it's just a simple off the top of your head brainstorm. Third step is deciding. So you got to figure out what those gifts are going to be. I usually keep an Apple Note on my phone and I have each person and I put, here's the gift we're going to get. The follow up is the other piece of it. So oftentimes we are waiting for gifts to be shipped, right? Did they actually arrive in time for whatever holiday you're hoping to get them for? Maybe you delegated some of this gift buying, right? So I say to my husband, I don't know what your mom wants. Make sure she has a gift, right? And I might follow up with him and say, hey, what did you get for your mom? Do we have it? Is it wrapped? Etc. So that's the monitoring. So that's one example, sort of seasonal, but we can also think about this at, the level of the day. So, for example, everybody's got to eat, right? You might anticipate the need to feed your family some sort of dinner in the evening. And then step two is identifying options. Maybe you have a list of 10 recipes that you rotate through. Maybe you've got, 5 takeout places on speed dial. What are the different possibilities that you could use to get this need of your family's met? You decide, call the takeout place or you ask your spouse to pick up some ingredient that you're missing on the way home. And then you follow up and say, okay, did my kid eat the meal that I provided, or do I need to go back to square one and, get a more palatable option because broccoli is out this week? Did my spouse remember to pick up the can of tomato sauce that I need for my spaghetti and meatballs? What's the wait time on this takeout place, right? And then if something goes awry, right, then you kind of go back to that identifying option stage and reroute. So this framework can really be applied to the decisions, big, small, in the moment, or spanning across, months or years in the case of decisions like how will we care for an elderly parent who can't live on their own, right? What are we going to do for our child who has special needs in school? So some of these are really long-term, big picture projects.
I love that the way that cognitive labor manifests is anything from like short term, run the household day to day, all the way to like very long term planning. I'm sure something even like where is our kid going to go to college or how should we start saving for retirement or like managing an elderly parent. And I think that framework and that sort of process of like the 4 steps, anticipation, identification of options, just deciding and monitoring is super helpful for me because I think a lot in frameworks, as do most of my listeners probably. So, one of the things that I found really interesting in your book was that a lot of times the sort of most thankless or least obvious parts of cognitive labor are this like anticipation and monitoring part. The most thankless, but often the hardest because it requires like forethought and then following up and things like that. And a lot of times that tended to fall in a lot of your interviews, mostly on women in heterosexual couples. And so I'm excited to get into that a little bit later in our conversation. But I found that really interesting way of breaking it down into, well, what are sort of low value, high load tasks? You had that really interesting one. And then this idea that like a lot of times when men get brought in, they sort of get brought in at the most like visible step, the decision, what are we going to do? But there's so much work that's happened before we even get there and then afterwards. So I can't wait to talk about this. So I wanted to ask you, this work is largely invisible, maybe except for the decision making. Why does so much of this work just disappear from our awareness? And even in your research, even for the person who is doing the work, they didn't even think about it, no pun intended. Why is this stuff so invisible?
I think there are a couple reasons here. So one factor is until very recently didn't have the language. If academics were talking about it, it hadn't diffused to the public. I see some signs that that's changing, especially for women. Most of the women I know, they're like, oh, every other post on my social media feed is about mental load. So I think that's changing. But when I started this research, it was 2017, and this was not a topic that was, all the rage. So one thing is we have frameworks for understanding chores, things like cooking, cleaning, shopping, driving kids places, mowing the lawn, right? Those were established categories. And people's mental model was, this is the work that's required. And so I think without the language to say these things that you're doing by instinct almost, right? It feels kind of intuitive or natural when you're just, oh, I'm thinking about stuff, right? It's not necessarily something that I chose to do in this moment. It just popped into my head because there was no language, because it was hard to point to a product, right? So if I am anticipating, okay, the holidays are coming, here's what we need to do for travel, here's what we're going to do for meals, right? That is a little bit amorphous in terms of what the outcomes are. To your point, until we get to the decision stage and the actual execution phase, right? That's when we start to see tangible products. And so for a lot of people, including the people doing the work, I think they just hadn't conceptualized that this was valuable. So I think about a woman that I interviewed, and I was asking her some questions about sort of what happens when you're low on toilet paper, right? I don't know. I just notice it and I put it on a list. That is something, right? That is not nothing, but it just felt to her like, okay, this is a matter of a few seconds here and there. And that's the other component of it that makes this really tricky is we're so used to thinking about work, whether it's paid or unpaid work, in terms of time, right? How many hours are we spending on chores, on childcare, on our employment? And cognitive labor doesn't really translate well into minutes and hours. There have been some efforts to quantify this work, and I think the measurement tools are getting better. But in the past, when they tried to quantify it, they would come up with maybe an hour a week. And that just did not match at all with the impact that my interviewees were telling me about, right? And I think that's because the clock is just the wrong tool for the job.
I mean, there's so much interesting in what you just said there. I know this is happening like in my household with my wife all the time because, we'll be lying in bed, it'll be 10:30 at night, and suddenly she'll go, "Oh, this thing has to happen." And I'm like, now that I have read your book, I have this language. I'm like, oh, there's some cognitive labor happening there. And I know this is happening all the time. And then my own experience, while I was actually reading your book, in the midst of it, I was like, okay, got to make flu shot appointments for my kids. So I did a bunch of like anticipation and planning tasks in between reading your book, which is part of the reason it took me a while to get through it because I kept interrupting myself to go, oh, I have to do that. Oh, are we out of toilet paper? Like, this is so funny. So that really kind of grounds it.
Your description of, your experience and your wife's experience really matches a lot of what I saw in the research. Before I got on this interview, I made sure my phone was on do not disturb, right? But you can't turn off these kind of metaphorical pings in your brain that are like, oh, toilet paper, flu shot, right? And so many of the women that I spoke with described it as this switch that they wish they could turn off when they were doing something, that was just for fun, for leisure, when they were in the middle of an important work task. And for a variety of reasons, they could not, right? And that's part of what makes this so disruptive is that even if it's just a few seconds, right, we know that multitasking, context switching is costly from a cognitive perspective. So that is where a lot of this impact come from.
Yeah. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about some of the really interesting contradictions that you found in your research. But first, I want to talk about the research itself. So tell me a bit about what you did to do the research for this book. And you mentioned starting all the way back in like 2017, starting to do this. So I'm really curious, the thing that was 8 years and 8 years in the making, what that looked like.
My husband, who, as I said, is an entrepreneur, likes to joke that, academics are quite slow. In the business world, we're snappier. So, yes, this was a long time coming. But it started when I was just really interested in decision making. I had done some work prior to grad school in behavioral economics. And one of the things that I learned was that decision making is costly along the lines of what we've just been talking about. If you have just gotten through an intense work week, and someone says, hey, what do you want for dinner? It's like, oh my God, I want you to decide, right? The last thing I want to do is to make another decision. I have no resources left. And I had been doing some interviews for a project that never got off the ground, but was looking at school choice. So this was in Boston, where I was for grad school, and schools were a big thing. It was not just a context where you send your kid to the, public school down the street. It was, we've got, almost infinite options here. What are we going to do? And I was talking to mostly moms, and they would say things like, well, we talked to some friends, we did some research, we put together a spreadsheet, we went to a bunch of open houses, and then we decided. And I asked them follow-up questions to really get at what the granular steps in that process were. And when I did that, the we fell apart. I heard from some friends that this deadline was coming up and that I should get on top of it. And so I, did a search. I went on some local parenting forums. I put together calendar invites for all the open houses. I sent them to my husband. We attended the open houses and then we made a decision. And I was like, wait a minute, that work, it doesn't really fit into the categories that we usually apply to housework, childcare, etc. The first round of interviews was with college-educated couples with young kids, 5 and under. These were folks who I expected were sort of in the thick of parenting, right? Most of them were employed for pay, and so they were in the squeeze, as Corinne Lowe calls it. And so what I wanted to understand was, what decisions were they making for their families? How was the decision work divided between partners? And what impact did it have on them? So that was sort of the germ of the project. And I realized that, okay, because we didn't have a lot of language around these concepts, I was going to have to come up with some creative ways to make this something people could talk about. And so what I decided to do was to model off what researchers often do for time use research, which is ask people to log how they're spending their minutes. And so instead of logging minutes, I asked people to log their decisions. I said, make a list of the decisions you make for your family or you're thinking about making for your family over the course of the day before the interview. And then I got to the interview and I interviewed each partner independently, sometimes back to back, so they could trade off childcare, sometimes Wednesday and Thursday. And we would go through their decision log and I would ask them, okay, you decided to feed your kid Cheerios for breakfast. What other options did you consider, right? How did those items get into your fridge? How did you know what your kid would like, right? All these questions that sort of helped get under the surface of the cognitive work that had led up to that stage. So I did all that research with those couples. And then I got a bunch of questions from folks who I was talking about this research with, who said, is this just an elites thing, right? You talk to college educated, middle and upper middle class folks. What would we see if we broadened? And so I did another round of interviews with folks with a wider range of educational backgrounds. And then I got questions that was like, is this just a straight couples thing? And so then I did another round of interviews with queer couples. And so all told, it was, I think, like roughly 175 interviews with the members of about 95 couples. And that's why it took so long.
Yeah, I was going to say amazing body of research, doing qualitative research and interviewing all these folks, not only the scheduling and finding the time on their calendars, but then doing it, synthesizing it, coming up with themes and hypotheses based on that. Yeah, no wonder it took years. Just thinking about that makes me tired. So when you did this research, did you kind of get better at doing these interviews over time and learn how to walk back or back up into some of the things that led there? So did you find that you got stronger as an interviewer or a researcher as time went on when you were doing these?
I certainly hope so. I think a few things that I got better at. One is allowing for silence. The patterns that we bring into our social conversations are not necessarily the ones that make for a good research interview. So, I'm not necessarily recommending this to you as a podcast interviewer, but allowing my interviewees to pause and think, right? And to know when the silence was, I have something more to say, but I'm deciding whether and how to say it versus I'm done. And then the art of the follow-up question, right? So I think one thing that separates a more sort of amateur researcher interviewer from a more seasoned one is how well do you listen to what they say and then ask custom follow-up questions, right? So you always start with a script, but then the interviews would often go off course because, they would surprise me. And so over time, I got more comfortable with just saying, this makes me curious. What do you mean by that? So those are a few of the skills that I had to work on.
Very cool. Yeah, I, as a podcast host, have been working on this myself. So we'll see how I do. In that research, you were then able to kind of bucket these different couples. You've got women led households, you've got man led, you've got balanced. And then, as you mentioned, you also looked at queer couples, and then you have imbalanced versus balanced households on that side. So can you help me understand those different buckets and how you determined like what bucket a household fell into?
Yes, I'll try to give you a snippet. It was a very painstaking process. But basically, what I did was I did these, hour to 2 hour interviews with each partner. And at the end of it, I would have a whole lot of examples of how cognitive labor showed up in their lives. I sorted through all these examples and I realized they could be bucketed into about 10 different household domains. So some of them will be very familiar, right? Food, shopping. But I was interested in the cognitive components of those. So not just who cooks, but who meal plans, who makes the grocery list, who notices when we're running low on things. And there were also a few categories that, I think are somewhat unique to the cognitive sphere. So things like travel and leisure, right? That's not a lot of physical chores there. It's more like who plans what we're going to do on the weekend or for vacations. Managing social relationships, right? Who is in touch with the extended family, who remembers birthdays. So I had these 10 categories, and then I sorted each couple's examples into those categories, and I looked at patterns of leadership and said, who tends to be the one who initiates, who takes charge in this domain? For example, in the cleaning domain, who is usually the one who says, hey, this is getting messy, we should clean this? Who's the one who remembers to re-up on wipes or Windex, right? And then I aggregated across the 10 domains to say, okay, who leads, cognitively speaking, in the majority of domains in the household? If it's a woman, it's a woman-led household. If it's a man-led household. And balanced households were those where, it wasn't exactly 50-50, but it was pretty close in terms of the number of domains that they each led.
Awesome. So basically synthesize this massive amount of research and conversation into thematic categories of cognitive labor. And then you said you reduced it to about 10, and then kind of be able to bucket in this particular household, a woman in the couple, let's say it's a heterosexual household, did like 7 or 8 out of 10 of these things. That's a woman-led household. Similar in the man-led household, and maybe more 50-50 in the balanced household.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think one of the big advantages of having talked to both members of the couple, and often on the same day or within a day or two of each other, was that I could get both people's perspective on the same issue. We know from other research that people are bad at estimating their own level of participation in household tasks. And so it was really helpful for me to say, who speaks with more detail about these things? I could ask people to narrate, how did the food get into your pantry? One partner would usually tell me, okay, here's this extensive system I have, here's exactly what happens. And the other partner would be like, well, we shop once a week and there's a list somewhere, right? And so that would tell me that, okay, even if they're both involved to some degree, one partner is really the one who's kind of driving this process.
Yeah, I loved so many of the stories in there. I also found what you just mentioned about like interviewing both parts of the couple. I found that oftentimes, and we'll get into this a little bit, in a woman-led household, the woman would maybe downplay some of that percentage, and the husband would come in and be like, oh no, it was like 75, 80, 90%. But then there were a few examples of women who were like, no, I do 100%, like full stop.
Yeah, that was fascinating to me and not necessarily what I expected, right? I would have expected both partners to play up their own contributions, and that wasn't the majority of cases. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I think perhaps because they knew that I was talking to their partner, they had an incentive to be a little bit more, truthful or complimentary of their partner. The other thing that I think is a piece of it too is that couples had these ideals of how they wanted to be. And so I think for a lot of women, they wanted to not feel like it was a really gender traditional division of this work. And so it felt a little bit bad to say, oh, yeah, actually, I think I do 80 or 90% of it. Whereas for men, I think they were often viewing it as very complimentary to say, my wife is super mom. She's the best. She's so good at this stuff. And so they viewed it not as, oh my goodness, so much work is on her plate, but look how much I appreciate and admire all the work that she's doing. She's so good at it.
You found, and specifically in different sex or heterosexual couples, that something like 80% of those households were women led. Was that surprising to you, or did that sort of confirm something that you thought you would find?
I remember sitting down with a mentor in grad school when I was, preparing to do this research, and she said to me, "You're going to have to find something more interesting than just women do most of this work, because everybody already knows that." So, no, it wasn't especially surprising. I felt like there were, a lot of references in pop culture and hints in other scholarship that probably women were going to do the majority of this work. And so that was like maybe the least interesting part for me. The more interesting parts, to my mentor's advice, were how couples made sense of it. How did they explain and narrate those inequalities and what created them in the first place?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about that. There's a lot of rationalization that couples were doing in your interviews. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So when I was going through the chapter on the woman-led households, there were times where I was laughing out loud at some of the things that the husband said and or wanted to just like throttle the husbands and be like, do more. And you raised some topics that we've discussed on this podcast before, like weaponized incompetence, which I love. But in addition to that, I wanted to get into the two different archetypes that you describe in your book. There's the superhuman and the bumbler. And so can you describe those two archetypes? Because I think that'd be really interesting for listeners.
Yeah. So I would ask people, we'd go through this whole series of questions about the nitty gritty of how this work is divided in their household. And then toward the end, I would ask them for an estimate, and this wasn't necessarily what I would take at face value, but just what's your perception of the allocation? You do X percent of this work, your partner does Y percent. And then I would ask them, well, why do you think that is? Right? Because often they would give me their percentage and say, well, it's not quite my ideal. Right. And so we would talk about like, where do you think this comes from? And the number one thing I heard from people of all genders in that response was, this is our personality. Right? They would say, one partner is a superhuman. She is type A. She is a multitasker. She's always thinking two steps ahead, right? She's just incredibly organized. And, sometimes it would veer into a more critical take, right? She's a control freak. Those words came up often. So that was the superhuman, right? Really on top of things, sometimes to a fault. And then the other partner in the relationship would be described as laid back, happy go lucky, a little bit disorganized, fly by the seat of his pants. Or, more positively, they would talk about how he was so present and in the moment. These archetypes are not all good or bad. They could be, framed in different ways. And what I thought was interesting was almost always the superhuman was a she, almost always the bumbler was a he. Right, and I went to the psychology literature on personality difference just to check and to be like, is this, a massive gender difference in levels of organization and executive function and things like that? Because it was just so gendered in the study. And, long story short, there are slight differences between men and women, but there's mostly overlap in the distribution of these personality traits. The level of difference that I heard reflected in the interviews was nowhere near a match for what we actually see at a population level in terms of how men and women are different from each other.
Yeah. And I'm going to talk about that with you in a second. But there's two interesting sort of asides that I wanted to bring up. One's a personal anecdote and one is a quote from your book. And so one of the women in your study had this amazing quote. This is one of those examples where I wanted to like throttle the husband. So she had this amazing quote about her husband, which was like, oh, he's never going to remember his mother's birthday. So that's my job. And I was floored by this. I was like, wait, the husband is not going to remember his mom's birthday? The person who brought him into the world? But apparently this is a thing. So it is that quote. I was like, I almost wanted to like throw the book across the room when I came to this. And then as another like personal anecdote, I was talking to a dad the other day and I asked him, who's your daughter's teacher? Who does your daughter have for kindergarten? He didn't know. He had to go ask his daughter for the teacher's name. And I was reading her book at the time. So I was like, this is an interesting example and like a sorting function for cognitive labor. I'll bet his wife knows the name of his daughter's teacher. He just couldn't be bothered to remember that factoid.
There's a really amazing research paper from around the year 2000. It's titled, "My Wife Can Tell Me Who I Know." And the argument was sort of this researcher was trying to interview dads about family life. And, she'd ask about various things like, the daughter's teacher or the daughter's friends. And the husband would say, like, my wife would know. Right. And so this is a kind of humorous phenomenon, but was something that did come up a lot in my research.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I think there's a really fun comic. Maybe you referenced her on your Substack, which is the Daminger Dispatch, which I love, who has like this quiz that you can take that sort of helps you figure out like who does more of the cognitive labor. And one of the things was like, can you name 3 of your kids' friends? And I was like, oh, well, I can do that. But I wonder if a lot of dads can. This isn't all, dad bashing here. I do want to talk about the male-led household, which is another slightly more rare one. The last thing I wanted to ask about is this idea of like rationalization and how couples did this. So I found it super fascinating that there was this huge disconnect between, I think, what you described as deployment and ability within women-led households. And a lot of the men in the study, even men who were described sort of fit that bumbler archetype, they have a professional job that requires an extremely high level of executive functioning. Like one of the dads, you covered this. I sort of was thinking this as I was reading it in the book, and then you went back to this. One of the dads was in the military, was a professional athlete, and then he runs scheduling. He's like second in command as an administrator for the entire middle school. That's his professional job. And so he has to do all the scheduling and things like that. So like military, professional athlete, runs scheduling, seems like a high executive functioning person. And yet this same dad was sort of the bumbler at home. Why is that? Like, what did you find about that disconnect between this deployment and ability within some of these households?
So I think that because so many men and women alike understood household cognitive labor to be a function of their personalities, they really didn't sort of look at, well, what's happening across spheres? What's my partner doing at home versus at work? What am I doing at home versus at work? And what I try to argue is that a lot of possibilities open up when we think about these as skills rather than trait-based techniques, right? So there's a lot of cognitive labor that, as you were saying, maps onto what we would traditionally call executive function. And I found that men and women were deploying them differently, right? So it would be very hard to argue that the male project managers I interviewed did not have project management skills. It seems as though they have these skills, they are just not deploying them in the domestic context for whatever reason. So then the question is, well, why might that be? I'm glad you said, this is not about dad bashing, because I'm a sociologist, right? My job is to say, what are the social forces? What are the incentive structures that are leading men and women down these different pathways? We think about what are men and women held most accountable for in the eyes of others. Men are held most accountable for breadwinning. That's shifted a little bit, but still this idea of man as provider makes sense, that more of his cognitive resources would be devoted to that task that he really sees himself as responsible for, expects to be judged negatively for if he doesn't live up to it, right? And then for women, we're held accountable for family outcomes, right? Does our child show up with seasonally appropriate clothing to school, right? Is our home reasonably clean? These are outcomes that women tend to be judged for, tend to, see as more essential to their identity for a whole host of reasons. And so it's not just about bad faith on the part of men who are saying like, not my problem, right? It's a lot more subtle forces that have gone into the fact that, yeah, you have a stronger incentive to lean in at work, your paid job. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing here, is that the perception is that the buck stops with her at home, right? And that she will loop him in, he should be helpful and supportive, but it is her domain. I think despite all of the changes to the gender structure over the past, half century or so, that idea remains quite sticky and helps explain some of these behaviors.
Yeah. So in a sense, is really the social pressure or this sort of external peer pressure in a way that drives a lot of women to assume more of the cognitive labor. Was that sort of one of the takeaways?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's who's going to be judged, who also is going to have to pick up the pieces if something goes wrong. So there's a great paper by some economists that they did an experiment to look at, who gets the phone call from the school. Women are the ones who usually get the phone call. Even if you say, please call dad, right? It's more likely to be mom. So part of it is anticipating consequences and saying, my life is going to be harder if we don't get this right the first time. Men are, for a lot of reasons, insulated from those consequences. And then another factor too is our social networks, and especially our parenting social networks, are incredibly gender segregated. I spoke with a number of men who would say, it would be really weird if I was calling another mom to make a play date for our kids. The ways that our communities are oriented, right? I could keep going and listing these factors, but suffice to say, there are lots of reasons that are not just, bad intent.
Yeah. We've talked about this on the show before, the dad who takes the kid to the playground and is the only non-female member of the playground community. And that sort of is an example of that in real life. One of the things you talked about that helps people rationalize this imbalance is, a lot of people saying, well, it's not a gender thing. You have an entire chapter, I think, called It's Not a Gender Thing. And that's a quote from one of the moms that you talked to. And you went from there to this idea of personal essentialism, which was an interesting concept that I had not really heard of before. So, can you tell me about what personal essentialism is?
Yeah, so this is a kind of play on gender essentialism, right? Which is the idea that we see certain traits, characteristics, interests, preferences as essential to the category of man or the category of woman, right? And so we might, make a gender essentialist statement by saying something like, women are just better at multitasking. That wasn't what I was seeing in my data. That came up sometimes, but much more often it was she is really good at multitasking. Right. And so there was this sort of separation. They were not calling on these gender categories. They were focusing on traits of an individual woman partnered with an individual man. But what I saw when I looked, across these, nearly 100 couples was, wait a minute, the superhuman is almost always a woman, the bumbler is almost always a man, right? And so it is a gender thing, but in individual couples, it didn't feel that way, right? And partly that's because they didn't necessarily want to do things that way. A lot of them talked about how they really saw the model of their parents and wanted to do something different. They viewed themselves as equal partners, right? They wanted to be in a relationship of mutuality and fairness. And so when they were confronted with ways in which they were not quite living up to those ideals, that was sort of uncomfortable. And so the rationalizations come in to say, we've been shunted toward this gender traditional division of labor for all the reasons we just laid out. This isn't what we wanted, right? And so it must be about something other than gender, right? Because this isn't what we set out to do.
Yeah. So it was like, it's not because she's a woman, but my wife just happens to be more organized than me. And that's her skill. And so therefore, she does the organizational tasks and the labor around organizing.
And for a lot of couples, that really kept them stuck because I would have women say to me things like, well, this isn't my ideal, but to change it, I would have to change my husband's brain. I can't or don't want to do that. And so I guess this is what it is. And so for a lot of couples, it sort of kept them stuck, but it reduced conflict, right? It helped them to say, well, no one is doing anything wrong here. This is just who we are as individuals. And so we're going to keep doing things in this fashion, even though it is suboptimal.
Yeah. So in some way, was there sort of a hidden undertone of conflict avoidance in some of this stuff? Like people maybe didn't knowingly do it to avoid conflict, but it sounds like that was kind of ever present.
I think so. I think that for a lot of women in particular, it was much easier to sort of accept an unequal status quo if they felt like this was just how their husband's brain worked, right? Rather than, for whatever reason, he is choosing not to deploy his skills in this home context. That was maddening. Whereas, oh, that's who he is. I don't know that it was a deliberate conflict avoidance strategy, but that was the net effect. And many women talked about how they had sort of had more of these fights earlier in their relationship and then kind of resigned themselves to this is just how he is.
Yeah. You mentioned this idea of mutuality, and you have a three-part series on your blog, and then I think in one of your papers you talked about the myth of mutuality. Can you explain the myth of mutuality to me?
Yes, this was a really fun collaboration I did with my friend Jacqueline Wong. She had done a research study focused on how dual earner couples make big career decisions. So things like where and whether to move for a partner's career. And I had all this data on how couples make decisions about how they manage their home lives. And so we sort of decided to combine forces and say, like, how are these dynamics playing out in these two domains? And one common theme in both of those data sets was that couples really strongly aspired to this idea of it's not you versus me, it's us, right? They did not like the idea of thinking about power and negotiations and your interest versus my interests. So we call this mutuality, right? That was sort of the thing that they defined as being a good relationship and what they wanted to believe they were in. But then we also show that when it came time to things like, dividing labor, figuring out whose interests carry the day when interests are opposed, that mutuality seemed to be more of a myth than a reality, right? Because men's interests were often the ones that, took priority when it came to the career space. And women's labor was often what was, running the household. So we tried to unpack and say, where does the mutuality ideal go wrong? And we have a bunch of different techniques, but we call it the myth of mutuality because for most couples, it was more of an ideal than an actual reality.
Oh, interesting. So like everyone's sort of like, this is what we want, but when the rubber meets the road, that was not exactly how things shook out in their household.
Things like, where they had two different opposing interests, right? His interest was for them to move to city A, her interest was for them to stay where they were, right? They would, have these conversations and sort of reframe things and say, well, it's, we've decided that collectively it's in our interest to move to city A. And it's like, wait a minute, his needs sort of subbed in for the we. And we argue that there's a lot of hidden power dynamics that make it so that that is what often happens for heterosexual couples.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about in the book is this question, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago, of like, can you become a cognitive labor leader or are you born that way? And you use an analogy in your book to talk about your own life and travel planning. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it sort of helps us understand whether people are born this way or become this way over time?
I am a horrible navigator, right? I put on Google Maps if I'm going places I've been 20 times before. It's, kind of a joke between my husband and I that I have no sense of direction. And so, as a result, he is kind of our navigator in chief. When we're going somewhere, especially when we're traveling somewhere new, right? He's the one who plans our route. He's the one who, says, okay, like this is the best option for getting from A to B. We should take the train or we should drive or whatever. And, the story we tell ourselves is that that's just because he's better at it than I am. But, when I really interrogate that, it's like, okay, he has put in a lot of practice. He finds it interesting to just like explore Google Maps. He enjoys kind of testing himself, right? Not using GPS navigation is better for your cognitive aging, and so he has these ideas that he doesn't want to use Google Maps, and so he has got a lot of practice navigating. The other thing though is that, I didn't meet him until I was in my late 20s. I had done a lot of international travel solo or with friends who also were not especially keen on navigation. And it's interesting that when I'm by myself, I manage okay, right? I suddenly can figure out, it's maybe not super easy from the start, right? But it becomes so over time. And so what I take away from that is that there are patterns that get ingrained. one of my interviewees talked about how, when you're with a partner, you sort of shut off certain parts of your brain because you know that they've got it. And eventually, it comes to really be this wide chasm between you in terms of your skills. And it can seem like that is just so innate. But when you sort of peel back the layers, it's like, well, my husband was not born with a great sense of direction, right? This is just something that for a whole host of reasons he's invested in. And now that we're together, I have many fewer opportunities to practice it. So my skills are atrophying as his continue to grow, right? And so these ideas about inherent difference, if you peel back the layers, are often much more about these broader patterns of investment and practice and learning.
That would imply that, with maybe certain exceptions, cognitive labor leaders in the household can be made, right? If you just invest enough time in developing those skills, even if they're not innately your skills. So
Part of the reason that Eric, my husband, is the one doing it is that he finds it enjoyable, right? And so in our relationship, like, because he likes it and I don't, it's sort of an easy complementarity, like, okay, of course, you take it. But I think that, for other couples where one of you does not have an intrinsic interest in whatever this is, you're just doing it, right? Those are opportunities where you might want to revisit and say, we could change this if we wanted to. It wouldn't happen overnight, right? Because, one partner has had much more practice than the other, but it is a choice that you could decide to invest in switching things up.
speaking of switching things up, this is a wonderful segue to talking about the increasingly rare male-led household. So this is the other side of the coin. This is where the men in a heterosexual relationship did more than 50% of the cognitive labor in a household. When you found these folks, these diamonds in the rough, what were some of your observations about those households, like things that jumped off the page for you in terms of differences between a woman-led household?
Yeah. So with the man-led and the balanced households, in I think nearly 100% of cases, these were households where partners had equal careers in terms of earnings and hours, or her career was sort of bigger, right? And so it seemed like a prerequisite, at least in this sample, was for her career to be, significant, on parallel or even greater than his in terms of what it brought to the family financially or what it took from her in terms of time. So that was one thing that stood out. The other thing that stood out was that the man-led and woman-led couples were not quite mirror images of each other, right? So I did not interview any couples that were kind of 90-10. He was doing the vast majority of the cognitive labor. There were a few areas in particular where even in those man-led couples, she still took on, the leadership role. And that was particularly around kids and managing things like the pediatrician, managing the relationship with the school, managing the relationship with the kids' friends, right? And so that says to me that something about, motherhood is really closely tied to this particular role, right? Probably because of the expectations that we talked about earlier, possibly because of, early patterns in terms of, okay, she's breastfeeding, and so she builds this different relationship, and then that spirals. The other thing that stood out to me was that the man-led and balanced couples, I think I expected that they would be really different in terms of their ideology. Like, I expected that these would be these, kind of uber feminist couples. And that wasn't really what I saw. They were much more regular couples. Some of them had set out, not necessarily for, capital F feminist reasons, to shape their lives in a way that gave her career priority or that gave their careers equal priority. There were some couples who were really kind of intentional in that way, but there were other couples who really just sort of fell into that division. They had these unexpected shifts where usually it was that her career took off while his career kind of stagnated. And in those cases, they responded and they shifted things, or, this was already happening. And so when they had kids, he kind of took on more of a lead parent role. And so there wasn't, like, people sometimes ask me, like, what's the secret sauce?
How do we do it?
Exactly. I don't have that magic formula. There were multiple pathways in, which I think is, also good news, is that if you're not in, a situation where you planned on this from the start, there are other ways that you can get there later on.
Yeah. One thing I found really interesting is like you sort of posed this question in the book, which I'm not sure that you were able to answer really, which is this idea of like, does career success lead to cognitive labor equality or a male-led household? Like, let's say if the woman in the household has a more greedier career, or is it vice versa? Does the like high cognitive labor equality lead to more space for a woman to kind of be a leader in the workforce as well? Did you find a correlation, or I can't remember if you drew a conclusion there?
Yeah, no, that's a good catch. I don't think I have the data to really definitively say. My best guess is that they're kind of mutually reinforcing, right? I don't think it's a clear A to B. It's more like these both sort of feed into each other and create something. One of the things that I really did see was that the actual facts of each partner's career are important, right? So I mentioned a minute ago that, in these man-led couples, she always had the kind of bigger career. But there were a number of couples for whom that was the case, and she still did the majority of the cognitive labor, right? So I think sometimes people get stuck on the economics and think it's just a story about earnings or hours, and I don't think that's true. I think what really matters above and beyond is what meaning do partners apply, right? Do they see it as, oh, this sort of interesting fluke that she's currently the higher earner, but he has this, bigger ambition. And so like he's still the primary career in our household, right? Or do you say, huh, for whatever reason, she's got higher earning potential. She seems to be on a good track. Like let's run with it. The facts are they're not irrelevant, but couples can make very different meaning out of the same facts. So I think it's more about their values and perspectives and whether or not they're aligned in terms of what they want this to mean for their family lives.
One of the takeaways that I had from your book is that in these male-led households, and you sort of alluded to this in our conversation, you don't necessarily see that the bumbler and the superhuman roles like flip or invert entirely, which, is what one might expect before they read the research. So was that one of your takeaways, that like that didn't necessarily equate to an inversion of those archetypes?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there were elements of that, but it was a little bit more domain specific, right? So in the kind of woman led households, it was sort of a global, she's the control freak, she's type A, he's laid back. Whereas in the man led couples, it would be more like, okay, he's a bit of a control freak for cleanliness, right? And she's a bit of a control freak for this. So it was a little bit more specific to issues rather than like our global personalities.
The other thing that I found really interesting, and maybe not surprising, and this comes all the way back to what we talked about with sort of external pressure or social pressure, is that in a lot of these male led households, it seemed like the woman in the household felt a lot more guilty about the fact that it was a male led household, or that there was an imbalance skewed towards her partner. And they seemed to care a lot about that balance when there was this male led imbalance. Men didn't necessarily seem to care the same way. Is that a correct takeaway from the book?
Yes. So I did see that when a couple was male led, usually she did not sort of see that as permission to check out. So I had some examples of stay at home dads partnered with employed moms. And she usually kind of kept tabs on, okay, here's what's happening, here's the schedule. I try to, be cognizant of the fact that he's been on all day. And so I think about, what can I do from the office on my lunch break? Whereas, if it was the reverse situation, got stay-at-home mom with an employed dad, it was sort of like, well, that's her domain. And so I think that for these man-led and balanced couples, there was a bit of a sense that they were transgressing norms. And that was something that, in various ways, both partners had to deal with. And for women, it was, oh, am I putting too much on him. This is more than the vast majority of men are doing. Like, is that okay? Whereas if you're doing the norm, if you're following what the majority of people do, there's less sort of guilt and uncertainty because it's like there's different, negative emotions perhaps, but not that kind of, oh my goodness, I'm breaking a norm.
So I want to talk about solutions or things we might explore in just a minute. Before that, though, I want to just talk really briefly about the balanced households. You broke balanced households down into kind of two structures. Can you tell me about the two different structures or ways of defining that balance that you uncovered?
Yeah. So if you think back to what I said earlier about the 10 domains of household life, right? The cooking, the cleaning, the travel, the kid management, couples could reach balance in two ways. They could either split things and say, okay, you, partner A, are going to handle cooking and shopping and travel, and you, partner B, are going to handle kid stuff and home maintenance and finances, right? Those would be the splitters. The sharers were folks where domain leadership was quite fuzzy, right? I got really frustrated sometimes with those couples because I couldn't categorize them. There was no clear leader. But eventually I realized, okay, this is a way of achieving balance is that both partners are invested in making decisions about food. Both partners are invested in making decisions about childcare, right? And so those were kind of the two pathways that couples reached balance through.
I mean, I have to say, just reading about the sharers and that construct, it sounded exhausting to me. I was like, you're involved in every decision together. How do you find enough hours in the day to do this? I also was struck that in the balanced households, not everybody seemed completely happy with their sort of situation and setup. Was that something that you found, or am I like just interpreting that?
No, you're not making that up. And I think that's something that, if we talk about my evolution over the course of this research, I think that I had this sense that, well, 50-50 is the good thing. That's what we should strive for. And some of the least happy seeming couples were those who seem to have achieved that 50-50. So what I make of that is what matters most is that you are clear about your values, your priorities, your desired outcome, and then are you able to reach it, right? Is your life in alignment with those values? And for some of the couples I spoke with, where her career had taken off, his had kind of lagged, part of the frustration was this was not what one or both partners had wanted or expected for their lives. And so there was this dissonance that, oh, I'm in this role that I didn't expect to be in, right? And so I, do not necessarily advocate for every household going for balance, right? I think there are a lot of reasons that a couple might be woman-led or man-led, or imbalanced if you're in a queer partnership. And it's more important that you do that mindfully and that it is a decision rather than something that you just default into.
When we think about this sort of societal pressure, cultural pressure that people feel, and we talked about how that reflects on the moms in the women-led households, I found it really interesting that many of the people that you talked to had kind of fallen into what you described, this sort of male-led situation, because maybe the woman's career had taken off. And reading some of the commentary from the people that you interviewed, it's almost like the dads felt bad about this because they weren't living up to their ideal as the breadwinner. It's sort of like you also mentioned the idea that the dad's domain is like the lawn. If the lawn looks nice, I'm doing a good job as the man in the household. But this sort of cultural pressure in reverse or on men was really apparent in a lot of these interviews, that they just like weren't getting the job done. I felt for a lot of these dads because I thought they were doing really valuable work.
And I think in, our conversations about, patriarchy and things like that, we sometimes miss the fact that this stuff hurts men too, right? There's a lot of research to suggest that the opportunities and options for women have expanded a ton, right? We really leaned into this idea that girls can do anything, they can be anything. And we haven't seen a parallel expansion for men. There's still a much narrower set of societal expectations So I think that's some of what was reflected in those men's unhappiness was, okay, I find myself in this situation that is not what society has told me a man is supposed to do. There's this real kind of pain there. And so I think that some of our collective work is to reimagine, right, our possibilities for, okay, this is, being a good dad can take all these different forms.
I want to talk about solutions, which you kind of end the back part of the book is about like what might we explore here. You also wrote a paper, I think you have a 2020 paper about, and this came up in the book, about how couples kind of degender their decisions when they say things like, well, it just makes sense this way. And so if you're a parent or a couple that wants to change this story, what are some steps that people can take toward, I guess, like regendering their awareness in a healthy way?
Yeah, so I think that for a lot of couples, they sort of viewed it as if this is a gender thing, then we have somehow failed. And for me, I find it much more helpful. As I said, I'm married to a man, right? We deal with these same challenges. For us to say the system is sort of rigged against us, right? For heterosexual couples, we've talked about many of the reasons that the path of least resistance is to be woman led in a lot of ways, right? And so I think that starting by acknowledging that you can really have good intentions and yet find yourself here. So I think that for couples to acknowledge the reality of, whether or not this was what we wanted, it makes sense that we ended up here, right? Now we have a choice. So step one is really to say, like, what is our current division? And then step two is to say, how does that map onto our values, our goals, right? Do we have different values and goals? In which case, maybe we need to do some negotiating and conversations to really try and find ways to reconcile them. But if we are afraid to acknowledge that gender is playing a role in our relationships, what happens is that it just goes underground. And when things are underground, you can't really address them in a thoughtful way. And so it feels hard and scary to bring these things to the light. But I think once you do that, you open up new possibilities for figuring out whether and how you want to change things.
You just talked there about like a couple of the steps or the sort of process that people can and should go through if they want to change this. In your book, you talked about this as recognition, reimagining, and reduction. Can you talk about those sort of three, I guess I'd call them phases?
So before we can make any changes, we just have to acknowledge that this is work. This is work that is falling disproportionately on some shoulders more than others. And so part of, what I hope to do with this book and with my research is to bring this to more people's attention. I said to you before we started recording that I'm so happy to be talking to an audience of, primarily men, because I think that part of this is really conversations that we're going to be having across genders that men need to have with other men. So this feels like, part of that work. Step two then is reimagining. So oftentimes something is an ingrained pattern, it's the status quo. It's hard to see how it could be otherwise. And so I think part of what we need to do individually and collectively is to say, what if it looked different, right? What if gender was not the best predictor of the amount or kind of cognitive labor you did for your household? What else could there be? So opening up new possibilities, recognizing that it could be otherwise. And then the third step is sort of reduction, right? This is a heavy load that is borne disproportionately by women. And here we have options. They're not mutually exclusive. I think the path that many people go to first is to say, well, how do we reallocate within households? How do we take more off mom's shoulders and put more on dad? And I'm, all for that. And if that's what works for a couple. But I also think that we need to be recognizing that some of this work does not need to be put on families at all, right? There's a lot of work. Our standards for parenting continue to ratchet ever upwards, right? Our social supports continue to ratchet ever downwards. And so some of the work that needs to be done is saying, how can we support households? How can we take some of this cognitive burden off everybody's shoulders? It doesn't need to be divided at all. And I think that is kind of an underexplored pathway in some of these conversations.
A lot of the people who listen to this show are company builders. So they're in the CEO seat or the founder seat, or they're executives at their company thinking about balance and how do I strike it. But I'm wondering if those folks want to help drive some change. Again, it's primarily a male audience, although a surprising number of women listen to this show. When you think about from the perspective of a company builder, if we were giving some advice to somebody who's doing that, what can a founder, a CEO, a company leader do when they're building their institution at their workplace to kind of help ease that cognitive labor burden for the people who work for them?
So there are a number of pathways. I'll just name a couple. The first one that comes to mind is parental leave, right? That is huge. And I think in particular, paternity leave, right? So oftentimes, if you are the person who actually gives birth to the child, right, you are given much more leave than the person who is, the partner of the birthing parent. And what my research and other research shows is that that creates these early day inequalities where she's home for longer, often by herself. She becomes the expert in all things baby. And that is a pattern that is very sticky. And so there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that more paternity leave is associated with a lot of good outcomes on a range of indicators, including the division of labor, right? And I think giving paternity leave also for leaders to model actually taking that paternity leave, right? And encouraging it's not just the policy, it's how do you actually create a culture where people feel okay to do it, especially men. That is one avenue that I would love to see more company builders invest in. Another one though is that okay, we know that the early days are really important. If we think about childcare as cognitive as well as physical, what we see is that as kids age, the physical labor burden goes down, but the cognitive labor burden tends to go up. And so part of what I would love to have companies do is think about not just how do we support parents of newborns, right? That's important. But how do we recognize that these caregiving needs are going to continue throughout the life course? If you have folks in kind of the sandwich generation, maybe they're also caring for elderly parents, right? And so understanding that flexibility is important and predictability is really important. A lot of the trouble and a lot of I think the reason that companies lose top talent, especially top female talent, is that they require a lot of kind of on-call time that is just really hard when you also need to be on call as a parent. So finding ways, whatever that looks like in your particular context, to build in flexibility and predictability for your employees, I think would be very helpful in retaining that top talent and especially that top female talent.
Okay, so better parental leave for the non-birthing parent. That's one. And then building in more flexibility and predictability into scheduling so that folks can not have a lot of those conflicts that require a lot of mental gymnastics to work around. I love that. Dads who are listening, founder dads who are listening, make that happen. Okay, let's talk about individual on an individualized level. So, what are some individual tactics that you'd like to see enacted? Or I guess, put a better way, like if you're in a household, what do you do differently? How do you get there?
So one of the things that, I think we miss in these conversations is not all tasks are created equal and not all people experience all tasks in the same way. My husband and I, right, I'll give an example from the physical labor realm. He, doesn't love doing dishes, but he doesn't mind doing dishes. I hate washing dishes. Your hands get all wet and dirty. I find it very satisfying to put dishes away from the dishwasher, right? And putting them in their place and knowing where they go. And that is something that we didn't realize until we actually did an exercise where we made these columns and said, these are tasks that I actually enjoy. These are tasks that I really don't want to do. And these are tasks that I'm sort of neutral toward. And we were in the lucky position of a lot of my absolutely nots were in his, yeah, I like this. Right. And so thinking about the subjective experience of tasks, those are going to hit differently for different people for a variety of reasons. And so that is a piece of this where you can ask yourself or ask your partner, what are you currently doing that you hate? And if one partner hates it less, right, that's an opportunity to really, use comparative advantage to work for you. Another thing that I really try to tell couples about if they're trying to make changes is you kind of have to think about these things as long-term processes rather than overnight transformations. Because of the dynamics we talked about, where one partner has gotten a lot of practice, right? They've built skills, they've built preferences and patterns and relationships and knowledge, right? That is not something that you can flip a switch and change. And so if you are trying to do something differently, then I think you have to give it, a good trial period, right? Depending on the task, maybe that's a few weeks, a few months, whatever the case may be. Don't expect it to be without some initial friction. Both of you have to kind of like buckle up for a little bit of a bumpy ride. And one of the ways that you can set yourself up for success is to start with tasks that are a little bit less stressful for one partner to give up. So I usually recommend that you start with more kind of internal facing tasks like meal planning or, something with finances or home repairs or whatever. Because if you start with planning the kid's birthday party or you start with, communicating with the extended family, oftentimes there's a lot of anxiety through that handoff. Like, did it get done? You did it differently, right? And so if you can kind of set yourself up for success and get some proof of concept with the more stress-free handoffs, then you can work your way up to some of those, harder ones.
Yeah, we talked about on the show when we talked about giving kids the opportunity to make mistakes and sort of build to more complicated decisions. This is the same thing in the household. Like moms in the women-led household, like allow your husband to have maybe a slightly less visible, slightly less big stakes, role in the cognitive labor stuff and more inward facing at first, and then build up to the Chuck E. Cheese birthday party or whatever. So one of the things that you mentioned going through this exercise with your husband, it sounded a little bit like Eve Rodsky's fair play system, which I'm sure you are intimately familiar with. Is that something that you recommend couples do? Many people have talked about this on the show and having this sort of like division of physical labor at least. But I don't know, does Eve Rodsky's stuff also cover cognitive decision making? I can't remember.
It does. She calls it slightly different things. So she calls it like conception, planning, and execution, right? Are her kind of three categories. But that's usually if people are like, we're both on the same page, we just need a good system. That is what I recommend people pick up because, you'll find ways to customize it for you. But I think it does the best job of really sort of making things concrete and making it not just about the physical chores, but also bringing in that mental component. If there's other couples where they're not aligned in terms of what they're going for, they don't have buy-in, then that system is not going to solve that for you. But if your challenge is really, we just need a system, then I think fair play is a good one. My husband and I do our own kind of like custom one, but it has a lot in common with the fair play system.
I wanted to ask you, I'm hoping this is a slightly optimistic question, but have you ever seen or did you come across in your research couples who have successfully rebalanced in the direction that they wanted to? So like acted on some of your advice and were able to do some of the shifting of cognitive load.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is often an uphill battle, right? And for many couples, it's sort of going from 90-10 to 70-30. It's hard to, especially if you are, in the stage of life where you've already been together for a decade, you've got two kids, you're busy. But I have seen couples, oftentimes this comes from they've reached a sort of breaking point, and she has said, like, this is not sustainable for me. I'm unhappy. And he said, oh no, that is not what I want, right? And they've found a way to kind of make shifts. Kind of going back to the balanced couples, there's not one formula, right? I think that each couple sort of finds their way to it. Sometimes it looks like a radical reimagining of their careers. Sometimes it's just we started doing a weekly meeting. Right. My husband is really into Notion. And so we set up this Notion database and we translated this into terms that he could connect with, like a system that he felt bought into. Right. And so that the actual pathway is different for each couple. But I do think that, unfortunately, it's often, as I said, after they hit breaking point, but sometimes beautiful things come out of that.
The husband who's very into Notion sounds a man after my own heart. So, okay, last thing for this part of the episode. If I were going to change or add a question that I should ask dads on Startup Dad to bring more awareness to this, to help make progress, make us societal forward progress on this, what's a question that you think I should be asking guests about cognitive labor in their household?
One question you could ask is, what area of your household's life or your parenting do you kind of own end to end, right? What's the thing that you're on top of? Because a lot of times, most of the men I interviewed, they did have some aspect, right? I met with some dads who were really passionate about kids sports, right? And they're, on the lookout. They want to coach the team, they want to like work with their kid, and they want to coordinate. For others, it was, I feel really passionate about our home technology setup. Like, I'm the one who owns the IT for the household. Sort of asking, like, what are you excited about? What do you own end to end? What is your specialty? I think would be a good one to sort of normalize that, yeah, like there are some things that are, you got it, right? Your wife is just sort of tuned out.
I love that. I'm going to find ways to work some more cognitive labor questions into the show. So, okay, I wanted to ask you just a few kind of personal things since we spent so much time on your book, and then of course we have a very short lightning round. So, is the first one for you is like, how did you get into this field of study?
I think I have the opposite path for a lot of people. The usual story is I became a parent, and so then I wanted to research parenting. I was single, I had no dependents, human or furry, or I didn't even have a car, I didn't have a mortgage. It really started from kind of some of the questions I had about what was possible for my life, what I was seeing in many of my peers. Spoiler alert, I now do have a child, but at the time I didn't know if I wanted kids. I didn't know if that would be compatible with, what career ambitions I had. I was watching friends get into these relationships with men and sort of downgrade their ambitions and their plans for their lives. And so part of that was just wondering, like, why does that happen? How does that happen? Is there a way to prevent that from happening if that's not what you want? And part of it was a little bit of indignation. I was in my first year graduate classes and reading a lot of classic texts on gender inequality and family life. So Arlie Hochschuld's The Second Shift is the book that really kind of galvanized me. I was like, wait a minute, this is still true, right? This is how my parents do things. This is how many of my friends do things. And I really was kind of frustrated, right? I had been, I grew up in the kind of girl power, boss lady era of feminism and was like, wait a minute, I thought these were problems that were solved. So it was a little bit of like curiosity. What could this look like? If I go down these paths, and a little bit of anger at what I was seeing in the data that so many things that I thought were problems for my mom might still be problems for me and for my generation.
Yeah, I look around even in my neighborhood now, and I live in a very liberal part of the country and with many parents who are of similar age to me and see the same issues prevailing here. It's really interesting. We've made some progress, but maybe not as much as we like to think. So you did mention that you have a kid. You now have a daughter, 6 months old. Congratulations. And you have a partner. And as an aside, I think before you were married, maybe when you were dating, you wrote a Substack article called "What's It Like to Date a Gender Scholar?" and you interviewed him. Your husband's name is Eric, so you interviewed him, which I read, and it was awesome. He seems a fairly progressive husband, so that's great. But I wanted to ask you, obviously you started a lot of this research well before you had a family, as you just mentioned. Has your view of your research changed at all since you've become a parent, or are you more critically aware of this stuff, or have your thoughts on this changed at all?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that I think has shifted for me is just I feel a lot more compassion and empathy for the couples that I studied. And I tried to do that throughout, but sometimes, I had moments where I'm like, oh my goodness, why are you doing it this way? Now I just feel very viscerally how much it's not just about what you and your partner want. So to give you one example, when I was pregnant, I started fielding all these texts and phone calls from extended family about the registry and about the shower. And I was like, wait a minute, if I don't say something, I'm going to be the liaison for all of these, matters going forward. We didn't ask them to reach out to me. We didn't like say, okay, this is an Allison thing. And so that was just a moment of like, oh, this is sort of just kind of inertia will take you in this direction. And it is exhausting to push back sometimes, right? In the early newborn phase, when we were sleep deprived, my husband was actually a lot better about this than I was, in the sense of saying, "Hey, I've read your stuff. I know that we are setting important precedents and patterns for ourselves. Do we want to do it this way?" And I would be like, "I'm too tired. I just want to do whatever is easiest." He was the one who was really good about saying, "We need to be strategic because it's hard to change patterns. It's much easier to set them the way you want them from the beginning."
In setting them from the beginning, how did you approach that conversation, or how did you and Eric approach that conversation with each other? Certainly, I have a ton of people who are what I would call parenting curious on this show. And I think also a lot of people listening to this show are wondering, like, well, how do I make all this work when I have a career? And a lot of dual income households listen to this show. You're at a slight advantage because this is your field of study. And he knows getting into a relationship that this is your field of study. But were there any ways that you discussed it or talked about it in the run up to starting that family that helped you maybe get closer to the path that you wanted?
Yeah, so a lot of conversations, and conversations at all different levels. Conversations at the sort of nitty-gritty of, okay, what are we going to do for leave? He's an entrepreneur, as I mentioned, right? So his leave was really up to him. I, am an academic, and so I had a lot of flexibility there as well. And so it was like, okay, do we want to overlap entirely? Do I want to take longer leave? So that was, one example of the kind of granular conversation of what would be the implications, right? If we did it like this, like that, how do we make sure that both of us are getting time and practice in building skills, developing a relationship with this baby? And then we also have had a lot of ongoing conversations about the big picture, and like, what are we going for? Like, what would a successful combination of work and family life feel like for us? How much do we want to be able to focus on our careers? What time do we want to be sort of off limits from work? How do we envision that changing over time as our daughter grows? And so these are, not necessarily the kind of conversations where you come away with, okay, here's our 10-year plan, but more of just like, what are we thinking about, and what do we want? What would good look like? And then you can kind of work backwards and check in periodically to say, how are we doing on this? How does this feel? The other thing that, we think a lot about is, hopefully our lives and our relationship are long and, many decades. And so we are not necessarily going to be 50-50 every single moment, right? I launched a book this fall, right? That was a big career moment for me. And Eric really stepped up and did some solo parenting while I was traveling for book events. I think some of his travel will ramp up in future, and that'll be when I will step up. So really kind of saying like, this is something that is constantly renegotiated and revisited. It's not really a set it and forget it kind of thing, much as I would like for that to be. As our daughter ages and has new needs and patterns, we're going to have to keep revisiting and talking about these things.
Yeah, so I heard two things there that you said. One, and I'm going to very overly simplify here, but one is to just be clear on your goals. What is it that we want? If we know what it is that we want and we're on the same page there, then you can work backwards to figure out what do we have to do to get to those goals. It's almost like building a product. We think about that in my line of work. And the second thing that I heard is that, like, these are seasons of life. As you mentioned, your kids have different needs, and your daughter's needs and expectations and schedule and everything else will change. She's probably in the potted plant phase right now. She's about 6 months. Oh, is she crawling?
She's a mover.
Oh
She's a mover.
no, you didn't even get the potted plant phase. Oh, I'm so sorry. But, revisiting the conversation, revisiting even the goals. Do we still want the same end goal? Do we still want to achieve the same thing? And so it sounds like those two, and it kind of also just comes back to like conversation. Like, this is a conversation that never ends. It's very circular. Keep doing it. Okay, so I wanted to ask just a couple more things. You described just now, and I think in the very end of your book, I was wondering the entire time, I'm like, I wonder what kind of household Allison has. You use the word balanced towards the end of your book, and you describe your partnership as balanced. Does that mean the two of you striving for a balanced cognitive load household?
We are, yeah. I mean, I think that both of us have big career ambitions. Both of us also really care a lot about how we show up for each other and for our daughter. I have nothing against folks who decide to specialize. But for us, like, we both really want to be kind of equally invested in both domains. And we have realized that, that means that we have to be thoughtful about how we're dividing both the cognitive and the physical labor. And it's a constant work in progress. I think the research would support me that the transition to parenthood is a tough time for a lot of couples. It's a time when gender inequalities tend to widen. And so I think we're in a moment where we're really sort of like trying to swim upstream. I think we're doing a pretty good job. We just sat down last weekend and kind of revisited our division of labor and talked about how we were each feeling and whether we wanted to shift things and what were we going to do with all these new responsibilities that are coming up. It kind of goes back to what I said a minute ago that it's not set it and forget it. This is a conversation that we have pretty often. I think both of us feel empowered to speak up when it's not working for us. My husband said something, we had been sort of trading off on when we got to sleep in. And he was like, okay, the way that we're doing this is no longer working. Right. And it was sort of, okay, how can we revisit it? What are your needs? What are my needs? How can we be creative about it? And so it's something that I think both of us have to trust that, our needs are important to the other and that no one's needs are, going to automatically take precedence. It's going to be a conversation and how do we make it sustainable and pleasant for both of us.
Yeah, you went through a bit of a recognition and reimagining step there. I love that. Okay, I could talk to you for probably 10 hours, as I mentioned before, but I do have to let you get back to your life. And so I wanted to ask in parting before lightning round, how can people follow along or be helpful to you in your journey, your research, or anything?
The best way to kind of follow along is on my website, AllisonDaminger.com. You can learn more about my research. You can sign up for my Substack newsletter where I write about many of these issues. That's one thing. You can buy the book, What's on Her Mind, The Mental Workload of Family Life.
Got it right here.
There it is. Yep. And then the third thing that I'll just put out to your listenership is I am fascinated by the way that AI is potentially changing, family dynamics. I hear from a lot of entrepreneurs and builders who are, building these femtech products, and I really want to study them. I'm very curious about, well, how are people using them? The mental load in households, can they be tools for reallocating it more equitably? And so if there's anyone listening who's like, oh, I have some data or I have a way that you might be able to study it, that's something that I'm looking to do in the future.
Awesome. I love that. And I've got some people that I can introduce you to probably. So cool. Are you ready for lightning round?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. What is the most indispensable parenting product you've ever purchased?
That would be our Love to Dream swaddle. That was the only thing that got my daughter to sleep in the first few months.
Love a good swaddle. I know the feeling. What is the most useless parenting product you've ever purchased or was purchased for you?
My husband actually found a giant swing on the street, and it takes up about half our living room, but our daughter only lasts 5 minutes in it. So the sort of, square footage to use ratio is quite poor.
So it's probably going back out on the street sometime soon. Okay, this may be a better question for Eric, but true or false, there's only one correct way to load a dishwasher.
I say false. There are multiple correct ways, but some are more correct than others.
Okay. What is your signature mom superpower?
I think I'm really good at calming our daughter when she is really upset.
Okay.
She recently had some vaccines and was freaking out. And, those are the moments when I'm like, I feel like I can connect with you and help soothe you in those moments.
Oh, that's nice. And man, yeah, the 6-month-old vaccines, not fun for anyone. What is your least favorite parenting task?
Middle of the night wake ups.
Brutal. Yes.
Yeah.
Which is the crazier block of time in your house, 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. or 6 p.m. to 8 p.m.?
Usually 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., especially now that she's eating solids. That
Oh,
has, opened up some new cleaning tasks, shall we
yeah,
say.
she's eating and painting with solids. So she cannot talk yet, but when your 6-month-old is old enough to talk, what is one word that you think she would use to describe you?
Silly.
Okay. What is your favorite kids movie?
Ooh, I love a good Disney classic. I feel like I grew up on the Disney princesses, so I would say Little Mermaid.
Oh, awesome. What nostalgic movie can you just not wait to force your daughter to watch when she's old enough?
I think it probably same answer, right? Those Disney classics that she's going to reject because they're not bright and flashy and
Yes.
up to standards. But I'm hopeful that she'll hear me out.
Okay. Final 2 questions. How long can a piece of food sit on the floor in your house and you will still eat it?
30 seconds.
Okay. You do have a dog, I think. So as we heard
so
in
usually
the
doesn't get to that long.
right. And then finally, what is your take on minivans?
I'm not a very good parker, and so I prefer my cars to be on the small side.
Yep.
So minivan, for now, not on the table.
All right. No minivan. Okay. Well, Allison, thank you so much for taking all the time that you took today to join me. Thank you for writing this book and the years of research that went into it. Everyone should get the book and then subscribe to the Daminger Dispatch, which I am a huge fan of. It's awesome writing. So I wish you and your family all the best and all the best on your continued research as you go forward.
Thank you so much, Adam. This has been such a fun conversation, and I've loved connecting with you.
Thank you for listening to today's conversation with Allison Daminger. You can watch and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit www.startupdadpod.com to learn more and browse all my past episodes. Thanks for listening. See you next week.